Let's move on to talk about two different teachers. First, look at the picture on the left, where Tom is teaching a class. Where is Tom's attention? Where is the student's attention? Now look at the picture of Katie's teaching. Where is her attention? Where is her student's attention? Which teacher is a sage on the stage, and which is a guide on the side? Right. In Tom's class, the focus is on him, while in Katie's class, the focus is on the students. Now let's see Tom and Katie in action. Let's take a look at Tom. While you watch the video, think about the following questions. How does Tom start the lesson? What do you think he is teaching the students? What makes this a teacher-centered classroom?
Good morning, class. Today we're going to be talking about a new tense that you all haven't seen before. It's called the present perfect tense. Now, we have seen other verb tenses before, namely the simple past, the present, and the future. But the present perfect tense is a little bit different. Of course, simple past occurs in the past, the present is right now, and the future is what's to come. And those are pretty straightforward and easy to understand. However, the present perfect tense is a little bit more complicated than that. So complicated, in fact, that in some languages it's used totally differently. Some languages don't have a present perfect at all. Some languages, like French and German, use the present perfect as a substitute for the simple past in their spoken language. But in English, it does have a specific meaning that's different from just the simple past or the present or the future. In order to understand how to use the present perfect, we're going to see how it's formed.
So, how does Tom start the lesson? He starts by explaining the tense. What do you think he's teaching the students? He is teaching the present perfect tense. What makes this a teacher-centered classroom? The students are not contributing, the focus is on the teacher. Now that we have seen Tom, let's compare his class to Katie's. Now that we have seen Tom, let's compare his class to Katie's. As you watch Katie's class, consider the following questions. How does Katie start the lesson? What do you think she's teaching the students? What makes this a student-centered classroom?
Okay guys, let's start with some questions. Let's talk about how long we've lived here. So for example, I've lived in DC for 4 years. I've lived here in DC for 4 years. Kevin, how long have you lived in DC?
I have lived in DC for 5 years.
Very good. You've lived here for 5 years. Christina, how about you? How long have you lived in DC?
I lived in DC 2 years.
Good. You've lived here for 2 years. Simona, what about you?
I have lived in DC since 3 years.
Ah, you've lived here for 3 years?
Yes,
Okay.
for 3 years.
Very nice. And how about you, Natalia? How long have you lived in DC?
7 years.
7 years. Very nice. It's a long time.
It is.
Yeah.
Katie starts the lesson by asking students questions about themselves using the verb tense. She is teaching the students the present perfect tense. We can tell it is a student-centered classroom because the students are talking about themselves. Now that we have seen some basic differences in how new information is introduced in both types of classrooms, let's examine the differences in how questions are answered in teacher or student-centered classes. Let's return to Tom's class to see how questions are answered in teacher-centered classes. As we watch the video, keep the following questions in mind. How does Tom address Natalia's question? What makes this a teacher-centered classroom?
Are there any questions? Yes, Natalia.
What is auxiliary verb?
Great, that's a great question. Natalia has asked us what an auxiliary verb is. In fact, there are many kinds of auxiliary verbs that you have already studied. For example, I am going to the store. Am is helping the going. I can speak English really well. That's a special kind of auxiliary verb known as a modal verb that talks about ability. There's may. I may go to the grocery store tonight. That shows possibility. I may go, maybe, maybe not. Right? I am going to go to the movie theater tomorrow. Again, am going to helps explain the meaning of the verb that follows. So there are a whole bunch of different auxiliary verbs, and they're quite interesting.
Tom addresses Natalia's question directly and answers it himself. This response is typical of teacher-centered classrooms because Tom does not guide Natalia with examples to help her determine the answer herself or have another student help her answer the question. Now let's see how Katie, in a student-centered classroom, answers questions. Keep these things in mind as you watch. How does Katie introduce the grammar point? What makes this a student-centered classroom?
Okay guys, so let's start with the question. What was that question I was just asking? Can anybody give it to me? What question?
How long have you?
Ah, very nice. How long have you... What was next?
Living.
Oh, we can do lived. Good, lived. Good. We asked how long have you lived in DC, and what was the answer? For example, Christina, how about you? How long have you lived in DC?
I have lived in DC for 2 years.
Good. For 2 years. Excellent. Now we can use a different word here though, right? Simona, you actually used it earlier. What was the other word you used instead of for?
Since
Nice.
2 years.
All right, since. Good. And we need a little bit different expression of time here. Does anybody know? For 2 years. Which year was 2 years ago? What year?
2012.
Nice. 2012. Okay, so here's what we're going to be practicing today. You can say for 2 years or since 2012. Let's practice a little bit. Natalia, can you ask Kevin?
How long have you lived in DC, Kevin?
I have lived in DC for 5 years.
Very nice. Kevin, ask somebody else.
Katie introduces the grammar point by eliciting the information from the students. This is a student-centered approach because the students are contributing to the examples and using personal information in their responses. Now let's see how activities are handled differently. Keep these questions in mind as you watch Tom's teacher-centered class. What kind of activity is Tom using? What makes this a teacher-centered classroom?
All right, now that we know how to form the present perfect tense and what it means, we're going to do a little practice on transforming sentences from the simple present into both the simple past and the present perfect. So I've given you a handout that has some verbs and sentences in the left column. What I'd like you to do is to transform the sentence that is in the present tense into both the simple past and then the present perfect tense. So for each one of these, you're going to write down 2 sentences, once in the simple past and once in the present perfect. We're going to go ahead and take about 5 minutes to do this, and then we'll come back and check our answers. All right, let's go ahead and check our work. Number 1, the sentence was, I work in the factory. Kevin, would you like to transform that into the simple past and the present perfect for us, please?
Yes. Simple past, I worked in the factory, and present perfect, I have worked in the factory.
Correct.
Tom is using a transformation exercise, which focuses on forming the present perfect tense. This is a teacher-centered activity because the sentences are not related to the students' lives or used in a meaningful context. Now let's see an activity in Katie's classroom. While you watch, think about: what kind of activity is Katie using? What makes this a student-centered classroom?
Okay guys, so let's practice with an activity. You guys are going to be working in pairs, and I'm going to give each pair a set of cards. Question cards and answer cards. So let's pretend Kevin and I are working together. We're partners. Okay? So we're going to practice asking and answering these kinds of questions. Let's say I go first. I want to ask Kevin a question. So I take one of the question cards. On the back there's a verb. I have. So now I have to ask Kevin a question using this question form and this verb. So for instance, have. I don't know. Kevin, do you have a car?
Yes, I do.
Okay, good. So Kevin, how long have you had your car? Okay, so I asked him that. Before he answers, he has to choose an answer card. All right, show everybody what you have. Okay, he got since. So now you have to answer using since. So Kevin, how long have you had your car?
I have had my car since 2008.
Very nice. Okay.
Katie's activity has the students use prompts to ask each other about their lives. This is student-centered because the students are participating in a meaningful conversation and answering questions they might face in reality. Finally, let's examine the differences in how the different classrooms handle student errors. As you watch, answer the following questions. What happens when the student makes a mistake? What makes this a teacher-centered classroom?
Number 2, I do my homework. Christina, can you transform that into the simple past and past present perfect for us, please?
I did my homework, and then I have did my homework.
Not I have did. The past participle of do is done. So it would actually be I have done my homework. I have done my homework.
When the student makes a mistake, Tom corrects the student and explains why it was a mistake. This is a teacher-centered response because the student is not guided to correct their own mistake, and the other students are not asked to help the student. How does Katie handle student mistakes? Keep these questions in mind as you watch. What happens when the students make mistakes? What makes this a student-centered classroom?
Okay, you start.
Yes, how long have you
Kevin, how long have you
We have
worked
owned
in DC?
our house for 3 years.
3 years?
I have worked
Now I ask you.
in DC since
No.
2008.
So,
2008. Okay, thank you.
how long did you
You ask
know
me. Yes.
our teacher for?
Have you known your wife?
2 months.
I have known my wife since 6 years.
Since?
I have known my wife for 6 years.
There you go.
Since 6 years ago?
What year was 6 years ago?
Since 2008?
Nice. Good job, guys.
When the students make mistakes, Katie either writes down the mistake so she can address it after the activity, or she prompts the student to self-correct. This is a student-centered way of conducting class because the flow of conversation is not disrupted with error correction. Let's look at the following activities. Do you think they are student-centered? The teacher explains a new grammar structure, while the students ask clarifying questions and write notes on the explanation. This activity is teacher-centered, not student-centered. We saw this teaching style in the video of Tom's class, where he presented the grammar structure and the students took notes. The student sees or hears a grammar structure in context, and the teacher guides them to identify a new grammar rule. This activity is student-centered. This was seen in Katie's class, where the students were introduced to new grammar in context and worked with the teacher to determine the grammar rule. The student looks at a picture and describes what they see. The teacher guides the student to use targeted language. This is an example of student-centered teaching. The student records their presentation. The student and teacher then review the recording, while the teacher guides the student in identifying errors and self-correcting. This is an example of student-centered learning. The student reads a text out loud, and the teacher corrects their pronunciation. This is an example of teacher-centered learning, not student-centered learning. The teacher plays an audio and the student translates it. This is an example of teacher-centered activities. The teacher gives the student a task, which the student completes while listening to an audio. This is a student-centered activity. Now, you might say, I only have one student, so I cannot have a student-centered classroom. However, there are many ways to make one-on-one training student-centered. For example, this allows the student to ask a lot of questions. And the teacher talking time, or TTT, can be minimized to take up only 20% of class time. The student should speak for about 80% of the time in the target language. Instructors can elicit information from the student rather than telling information to the student. Similarly, the instructor's answers can lead the student towards the correct answer rather than revealing it outright. The student can make self-corrections instead of the instructor interrupting the flow of conversation to correct the student. The student can be allowed to discover a lot on their own, with the instructor acting as a guide. This concludes DLS's teacher training module on student-centered teaching. If you have any questions, please contact your language training supervisor.